as we've been talking, there's been some comments back and forth in Discord about people escalating their privileges because they want to log on to domain controllers and things like that. Putting that on their standard accounts. That's really, as mentioned, not a good idea at all. Really, overall, as I said at the beginning, AD, secure on its own. If you keep domain admin accounts on domain controllers and don't let them be anywhere, it's harder to escalate to that privilege. But as soon as you start giving other people domain admin, or you allow people to have accounts that log onto servers that domain admins are on, suddenly you expose things very quickly, and you make it very easy for an attacker or a pen tester to move through your environment and get that access. Yes, the CEO needs to be a domain admin. Probably not. Hopefully not. But you never know. It's kind of hard to argue that one sometimes if they're the ultimate person paying for your paycheck. But at least have some good auditing. The thing that I see happen quite often is, like I said, organizations are looking at the domain admins group and the enterprise admins group, but they forget about these other key groups like, backup operators and print operators, these things that are inherent that give extra permissions and rights, but they aren't looking for changes in that group. Or the one that I run into more often than I'd really prefer is where we are looking for changes in domain admins, but our team, our identity and access management team, or server support team, whoever it might be, created a new group that they made a member of domain admins. And then we can add and remove people from this other group as we want, giving those permissions. And nobody knows that it's occurring or what's happening because that's not being audited.
It's like a proxy group or something.
Exactly. It's a nested group. And suddenly all these things get all over the place. The other thing I often recommend for AD is, for your key groups, domain admins and things like that, don't just rely on looking for the audit event that says, hey, I changed, right? Something changed. Have, like, for app tests, it's unit tests or smoke screen tests, right? Hey, I know that these are the people who are supposed to be in this group. Let me go see if these are the only people in this group. Oh, somebody new is here. What happened? Having that level of access and that knowledge is another good thing to be looking at. Creates a new group called Domain Admins at CEO. Take screenshot. Perfect. I like your plan there, Aries.
A little bit of social engineering.
Yeah, there you go. It says domain admins. You are definitely a domain admin now. Perfect. Network access. Your favorite thing to exploit. You said before, right? So.
My favorite thing to exploit is the bidirectional host path melts.
Okay.
The network stuff, though, is interesting. And in Kubernetes, probably one of the best security controls is network policies. Let me back up a second and talk a bit about how I approach Kubernetes from a pen testing standpoint. When I first started learning and dealing with it, I kind of didn't really, I didn't have like a good model of it, I think, from a pen testing perspective. And as I started to work with it more, I realized, like, hey, this is kind of like a network pen test in a way. It's just slightly more restrictive in certain ways. And so I started treating pen testing a Kubernetes cluster like we do our network tests, or a lot of people do their network tests, where, for example, like, Eric's doing a Windows network pen test. A lot of times we're going to ship the client a physical device, our secure ideas attack machine, right? They plug it in, and that lets us assume compromise, right?
Yep.
And see where we can go. And then Eric will have DA in like 5 minutes. So I started kind of doing the same thing, where I've started maintaining a container that has like all my hacking tools in it. And I say, hey, like, deploy this in a namespace for me, or like give me permission to deploy it inside your cluster. And then I start to do, like, I run nmap, right? I start seeing where I can go, and I start trying to hit the Kubernetes API on the control plane, and things of that nature. Because ultimately there's other services, right, running inside this cluster. So there's avenues for pivoting through vulnerabilities in those services. I mean, so that's kind of why I start treating it that way. Now, where this leads is, right, you have that networking aspect of, okay, I have assumed compromise. Maybe I've assumed compromise in like the front end application namespace, right? And so I have my container in there, or maybe I actually compromise the app and I just have the ability to get a shell on that container, basically. And so I start probing around on the network, looking for other services to see what I can do. I start talking to that Kubernetes API. Well, really, like the front end app probably maybe shouldn't be talking to like the Kubernetes API, for example, or it shouldn't be able to talk to like services that are running in like a CI/CD namespace. And so that's where Kubernetes has the concept of network policies, which allow you to restrict the network communications between different namespaces, between the pods in those namespaces. And I find that's when that is keyed in correctly, that stops me a lot, right? That stops me from being able to kind of pivot and get the things I need to take it a step further to say, like, eventually deploy a pod and break out of the container to compromise, the node and still like a certificate or something that represents the kubelet, so on and so forth. Whereas like that's usually my end goal, is to compromise the cluster, like whereas with AD, Eric's goal is to like get DA and basically own the network, right?
Yep. Although, go ahead. Sorry, keep going.
Well, one note about the network policies, though, while that's my favorite security control in Kubernetes, it is not something you can use by default. The default network, a CNI plugin, which is container networking interface or something like that, the default networking plugin in Kubernetes doesn't support network policies, which is baffling to me that that's the case. That maybe has changed, or there's probably some like RFC like proposal for it or whatever. But you need a third-party networking plugin, and a lot of them do support the network policies. So network policies, use them if your cluster supports them. If it doesn't, maybe figure out how you can change to a network plugin that does.
Yeah, and similar for Active Directory, right? Well, heck, networks in general, right? It's expanding. That's the same thing. Network segmentation has been a statement for ever. We'll say 10 years at this point, I think is a good limiting number. Might be a little bit longer or shorter, but we'll say for the last 10 years. And domain controllers are one that I often see set up incorrectly. Sure, domain controllers need to have a lot of ports exposed so clients can reach to them. And then domain controllers between themselves need to be able to see even more ports. But what I often see is that you can use domain controllers to hop from one less secure environment to a more secure environment and then reach back out. We had a client where the goal was to get into a CDE, PCI pen test as always. The goal was to get there, and we could compromise the normal domain remarkably easily, unfortunately, through developer accounts. I think somebody mentioned that earlier in the chat here. When we talk about having credential compartmentalization or account tiering where you have multiple accounts doing different things, they should have different passwords. They shouldn't be able to span dev and test and prod. But we got through a developer's account onto a development server that a domain admin had also logged into, unfortunately, and moved there. And then we leveraged the domain controllers to actually go through the forest into the CDE. And then since domain controllers were able to reach out to all of the clients in the CDE as well, which doesn't need to happen, because domain controllers don't need to reach out to other Windows devices. They just need to reach back in. You were able to move through and move through a network. So this whole idea of limiting access is something that is not being done on networks. And maybe it's easier in a Kubernetes cluster, right, with your network policies, but it seems very difficult in classic networks.
Yeah, I think it's probably harder in a classic network because you have more, I think, flexibility in what devices are running and things like that, right? Like you need something that's you have to get in there and like control like your like routing tables or your mess with your routers and things like that, right? Your switches. In Kubernetes, you don't necessarily have to do that. Um, because again, you have the network policies, right? So you have this sort of infrastructure as code, pile of YAML that you can source control and version and whatnot. That of course is abstracted away from the networking, because you have these two layers now with Kubernetes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have your overlay network, which is the virtual network of the cluster, and then you have the actual network that the nodes and stuff are running on, right? Where they are doesn't even have to be on the same network necessarily, right? You could have one node in like some other region and then another node in a different region, and they can talk to each other through the overlay network because there's a way for them to route, underneath that. So now you still have to like protect that underlying network too.
Yep.
And so that's another thing is, right, in terms of not just the workloads, because network policies govern the networking between like your workloads in Kubernetes. You also need to be cognizant of the networking between your nodes themselves, and like isolate. For example, Eric was kind of talking about like isolating and segmenting off the DC. Kind of analogous, the analogous thing in Kubernetes is segmenting and sort of isolating and controlling access to the master node, which runs the Kubernetes API, right?
Mm-hmm.
Keeping that safe, not letting people, other services just talk to it, other devices in your VPC or whatever.
Yep.
One thing I see too that I don't like, and I get why it's sometimes necessary, but I don't think the approach is the best approach. For example, with like Google Kubernetes engine, the API server for the master node, so the whole control plane is exposed to the internet. It has authentication on it, but it's exposed to the internet. And what I'd rather see is some sort of identity aware proxy that's in front of that, right? So you can then use like your Google groups or your federated AD stuff, right? Kerber roasted Kubernetes clusters. That's a good point, actually.
Too much? Yeah, so Kubernetes running as a service needing AD. Oh my, that would be all sorts of fun there.
Yeah, I don't even know about that. Well, so here's the thing. One thing I often recommend too is to federate your IAM, right? In Kubernetes, because Kubernetes built-in ways of dealing with identity and users is not very great, right? So you don't have the concept of groups or anything like that. So I often recommend like integrate it with AD, right? Because now you have your AD groups and you have like your Kube developers or whatever, and that can tie into the service accounts and roles in Kubernetes. So in theory, maybe you could go from Kerber roasting some identity to now having, permissions within a Kubernetes cluster.
It's a wonderful attack that works because of the other issues I mentioned where people don't minimize permissions on these accounts. So because of how Kerberos works in Active Directory, well, Kerberos in general, but Active Directory too, you are able to request a Kerberos ticket for any account that is set to run a service and do Kerberos authentication. Since you can request that service ticket, that ticket is encrypted with the password hash of the service account. So it's a very easy way to quickly gather a large number of potential password hashes, take them offline and start cracking them. And as always, then we fall back to people using bad passwords, easily crackable passwords, very quick to gain some level of access on a server, typically administrative access. And then you run into the other fun issues where you have certain applications, SQL being my favorite, where when you install SQL, if you click the wrong button, it tags this identifier onto your account, and suddenly domain admins have a property on their account that allows you to request a service ticket and get their password hash for free. And then you take it offline, have a good time. So yeah, common problems that we see. And then we saw this wonderful thing. Somebody brought up a LAN and a DMZ, but there really was a full wide open any rule between the two, therefore kind of nullifying the DMZ. We see similar things. At least they tried to have a DMZ. Maybe they were doing some Logging. Oh, and somebody has the same CISSP book. Yes, we do have the CISSP mentorship going on. Not now, but we will in September. So that's a good one.
Hey, yeah, and I helped teach that because I
Yeah,
got my CISSP thanks to that mentorship.
there you
So
go.
just saying.
Nice. All right,
Just a little shill there.
yeah, a little shell for later as well.
Yeah.
Fries asked, "What's the most common security hurdle in Active Directory today?" So I'm going to assume, like, if I'm trying to protect, the biggest issue, honestly, once again, goes back to the two that I mentioned before, which is bad passwords and too many permissions. The whole goal when you're trying to attack AD is find a method to gain that admin access, right? And quite often it is done through bad passwords or the ability to jump from a workstation to a server where you get another person's account and then you jump to domain admin, because they are allowing domain admin accounts to run on member servers and regular users to log on to member servers. The two groups that I unfortunately pick on in most of my pen tests are developers and SQL DBAs. Those are the two groups that I quite often find their regular user accounts, even though everybody is supposed to have a separate account for admin functions, those accounts have admin access on servers. And then for some reason, once again, people haven't separated domain admins from like a server admin account. And so your server admins who are domain admins log onto that same SQL server or dev server, and you have access to those credentials. It's one step and you move on. Very rarely do we see this idea where I have a regular user account and then I have like a server admin account and then I have a domain admin account, and then maybe if I really need it, an enterprise admin account. So Fries, that is by far the biggest issue. The biggest issue really is, I'm going to say it because I like the term better, credential compartmentalization. You don't let more privileged accounts on less privileged devices. So a server admin should never be on a workstation. Your workstation should only have normal user accounts on them, and you need to do admin access on other things. That is by far the biggest issue. Yeah, please, absolutely, Eric. Yeah, run as is a great feature for making it easier for admins to do their work and a much easier way for attackers to gain access to those credentials. You should have jump boxes, other devices, something, right? Once again, an administrative account, except for a workstation admin account, which at this point should be something like Laps or local to that device only. If you want to use CyberArk or some other system, perfectly great, but add an account to that device only. Otherwise, they shouldn't be used. You should not put important accounts on your workstations or laptops.
Yeah, speaking of like a jump box and whatnot, that's also a concept with Kubernetes. This whole idea of like picking on developer accounts, for example, right? Applies here too. Mm-hmm. I haven't ran into it a lot in the same kind of perspective as like on a network test, like an AD test, where you might be kicking around in the network and you find that identity, or you compromise like a developer's workstation or something.
Yep.
But the concept is still there because Kubernetes has these like different forms of credentials, and one of them is like a kube file or kube config file that contains information about what cluster to use and the identity and credentials, so that the kube control CLI tool can pick that file up and then authenticate your commands to the cluster. So developers and admins will have those on their machines, right?
Oh yeah.
Typically. So if you're hopping around the network, you get on there and you find that, well, now you have potentially a way, right? Compromise of that kube config file is a big one. That's actually Microsoft put out a while back, like this mapping of Kubernetes to the what is it? The attack framework.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big initial access vectors is compromise of those kube config files for getting into a cluster. So yeah, we it seems like we as pen testers like to pick on developers.
We do, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I feel bad.
Yep.
Yeah. Or like I said, unfortunately, DBAs are my second biggest one. Cleartext files. Active Directory is a directory service, which means if you have an identity in AD, you can see almost all the information. Certain things are locked down, like password hashes. But now I've seen two clients, one of which was a very large client, and I thought would never do this, where they actually stored the password for service accounts in Active Directory itself. So therefore, not only I didn't even need to do file surf or file share surfing, I just had to look in AD, and you could get the passwords to these service accounts, including my favorite one, as always, granted domain admin access, because no one knows how to configure the applications and everything just needs to run this domain admin. There was a good question here. Which question there do you want to answer there, Cory?
It was the one about how do you think you could get like ops/dev not to rely so heavily on the Kube config file?
From Veritas. Very good. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to do this, and it all still comes back to that, like, credentials are credentials and you have to manage them somehow, right? And so ultimately, the roles that those are tied to need to be tightened down. You have that defense in depth kind of deal. But one approach I also see is organizations have some sort of SSO, and they use something like Jump. I think it's Jump Host, and there's another one that I'm forgetting the name of, right? So you essentially have like an identity aware proxy or system like that lets you manage your identities in a centralized way and tie it into that. Then you don't end up with these credential files getting, what I mean, essentially distributed right around. And it's kind of like a bastion host, right? There is the concept of basically deploying like a bastion container as well, that you've hooked into some kind of identity. I'm less of a fan of necessarily doing that, as opposed to using something like, a more managed kind of identity aware thing. And I wish I could, I'm going to have to Google around, because there's specifically a tool for doing this, and it's pretty nice. But yeah, so there's that. There's also, this doesn't solve the problem as much, but it's still an approach. If you're using like a managed Kubernetes service, like in the cloud, oftentimes there's the ability to pull down a Kube config file. But those can be configured to be short-lived, right? So you still have your, your sort of your centralized identity management, right? And, you use like the AWS CLI or some kind of tool to pull that config down for your devs and your ops. And that can be short-lived, right? And those also can kind of map to like your IAM policies. So you aren't necessarily managing two permission sets. Like, you're just managing the one permission set. And so like AWS, for example, has these policies that map to the same things in Kubernetes that you can add to those roles. Yeah, there's so much, it's a lot, right?
Oh yeah. Well, and I mean, you talked about short-lived. It made me think of something that I don't see many organizations doing either in AD, which is utilizing the protected users group, which is a special group introduced a long time ago now. Geez, 2012 R2. 10 years ago, that basically limits what an attacker can do with those accounts. It basically negates so many of the fun attacks we use with Kerberos or NTLM especially. It makes it impossible. Of course, it also makes it near impossible to use them for most apps, but that's a different issue altogether. So Veritas was saying, there's a question about browsing for cookies. Any resources for attack surface reduction in Kubernetes?
The Kubernetes documentation site has a pretty good article on securing a cluster as kind of a good baseline, right? And then I would probably move to looking at something like the CIS Kubernetes controls that they put out as kind of another way to start finding places to, tighten things down. There's also they link to this in that link that I just posted, but I'll post it as well. There's a security checklist that they have as well, which is really good to go through. It's really nice to see this kind of stuff, honestly, even though Kubernetes has got a lot of problems. it's really nice to see stuff like this in documentation. Because for so long, right, you look at documentation for stuff and it's like, you'll see examples in the documentation that's like, oh, don't do it this way because this is actually very insecure. But for the sake of example, and then there's no discussion on like, well, what should I actually do to be more secure?
Thank you for coming on and just chatting and answering so many questions. There are a few questions that I captured that I don't think we covered that I want to make sure get covered, and then just remind folks about your training coming up. So we had sure not. Do you think TLS between pods is a hill for security architects to die on? Having a hard time seeing a huge benefit. I have some opinions, but I'm definitely curious about yours.
Oh, yeah, that's a hard one. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good hill to die on or not. From my perspective, as like when I'm pen testing a cluster, that's almost like I don't even necessarily have to think about it because I'm already in the context of like the container, networking from it. It has its, certificates and whatnot.
When I was doing some of this work at my last organization, it was a hill for me to die on, but only with a caveat. It depended on the architecture of how they deployed. If for whatever reason they had to, make some security exceptions or things like that, I'd lean back on, okay, well, can we turn this on at least so somebody gets in where they're looking at the traffic and in that plane, we have some things there. So
well, it also
not the answer you're looking for, sure not, but
I was going to say that probably also depends on what you're passing back and forth there too, right? So
yeah,
anytime you're sending things like credentials or sensitive information, you don't want it in clear text. I mean, that's always a problem, right?
Yeah. So it depends.
It depends. The depends answer, the best way of going.
It depends. The famous answer that any engineer will give you about anything. Exactly. Like you can use the TLS between the microservices. Of course, if a container gets popped, there's not a lot that's going to do. And other security controls are then more important. So, but the TLS thinking about Kubernetes does come back to where I talked about how you essentially have two networks. You have the overlay network, and then you have the network between the nodes. I think it becomes more important there between like intra-node communication rather than necessarily the services. But then again, if like I can deploy a container, maybe I didn't pop one, but I can deploy a container to your cluster, and like you didn't tighten down the capabilities, and I have like cap net raw or whatever, then I can listen and try to sniff traffic. So depends on what you're passing back and forth, right? Again, if you have microservices communicating like sensitive PII or something, or credit card data between each other,
better be doing.
Now if it's credit card data too, especially now, it better be encrypted, right? So you have compliance issues. That's an excellent question.
We're making a big list of depends here.
Yeah,
right. I know.
That's why the best answer is yes, unless there's some reason you can't. I mean, from a security perspective, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's a good way to put it.
You nailed exactly where I always used to start was, this is as secure as we can make it. Now you tell me which pieces of these break what you're doing, and we'll figure out if we've got to unbreak it or get rid of it. One of the
and on it, with Cory saying PCI, as soon as you say we're passing PCI stuff without encryption, you automatically fail. You're done. It's over. You failed. Go back. Thank you. Have a nice day. PHI, all that good stuff. Yep, absolutely.
That's a really good question. I feel like this could be like a whole
it's a whole separate talk.
A whole separate thing.
Do you see control plane API abuse?
Like externally, I don't really run into that. I'm coming from a perspective where, like on a pen test, I already have some credentials, right? So that comes back to where some, like, I don't like this because some services like GKE expose that control plane to the internet, right? And while it has like authentication on it, it's relying on Kubernetes authentication. And I'd rather see some sort of, identity aware proxy or something like that in front of it. So I don't have a lot of experience necessarily attacking like the Kubernetes API externally. I'll say most of the time, if I see like if I'm doing a pen test that's just like external or web app, what the way I end up encountering Kubernetes is not by the control plane, but through some kind of headers that are leaking information that tell me, oh, this is Kubernetes back there. Or I will see like if I get an SSRF flaw, right? And one of the things I immediately put into my word list of targets to try to hit through that SSRF flaw are like the Kubernetes API internal like DNS name. So no, I don't see that a lot. But if the Kubernetes API is exposed, that is now opening up to risk for abuse, right?
Kubernetes security or Docker Swarm?
Docker Swarm is nice for smaller workloads where you don't need high availability, but you need to deploy multiple microservices. Kubernetes is really where when you need that kind of horizontal scaling, you have big workloads, and you need like identity and access management to tie into it. And, Docker Swarm really doesn't support that stuff very well. In my opinion, Docker Swarm's like a fancier version of Docker Compose, right? Where it can cluster and scale, but it's just much more simplified. I would even say that there's security benefits to it being simpler. Just in that there's less things to mess up.
So if you need the complexity, you got to go Kubernetes security. If you need simple, you might want to go Docker Swarm. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I know there was a lot of folks in Discord, a lot of chatter, and you were answering a lot of questions live. So thank you for that. And if people want to ask more questions, they should definitely show up and take your classes. We have a Professionally Evil Container Security PECSEC with Cory. And then as well, we have our Red Team Fundamentals for Active Directory, which seriously, I know we've talked a lot about Kubernetes. We even started the thing with, this is the sexy thing, but don't sleep on Active Directory. So many attackers are just living off the land with it. And this Red Team Fundamentals class that Eric's teaching is going to help you understand that. Gentlemen, thank you. We're going to hang out for a few more minutes. But for those that have got to drop off of the webcast or already have, thank you for joining us. We still have about 256 folks. Mike, are you in the sound of my voice, Mr. Sutton?
Show enough.
Hi, everybody. This is Mike Sutton. Mike Sutton was part of our content community team and is now doing a ton of work with Antisyphon to help folks get registered, understand what's going on, and get people get the word out about it. So, Mike, what's going on with Antisyphon right now?
Dude, so lots of really cool stuff. Dude, thank you, Cory and Eric. That was awesome. So big things with Antisyphon, obviously their training coming up here. And then I put a link in our Discord, and it's also in here for our live class schedule. So anything that's coming up within the next 6 months, you can see it on there, plan for it, put it in your calendars. We offer business training where it gives every user in your team access to our full course catalog. Almost 30 courses in there for our on-demand courses. And so I just wanted to make sure if anybody wanted more information on that, please feel free to ask more questions.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, from everyone here, myself, Antisyphon, from Black Hills Information Security, from Secure Ideas, thank you, gentlemen, for coming in and chatting and sharing about your class and just answering general questions about Kubernetes and AD security.
Thanks for watching. Achieve your next level of skills with training courses at antisyphontraining.com.